I didn't think it was a big deal at first. They were just toys, for crying out loud. Grown men shouldn't be so attached to little bits of plastic. But now I can't get the look on his face out of my head. That moment, the way his eyes changed, like something broke inside him. I don't even recognize myself anymore. Eric's always been the responsible one. He pays the bills on time, saves for our future, and even plans thoughtful things for us, like a weekend getaway or a fancy dinner for our anniversary. But no matter how much he handles the adulting, I couldn't help but fixate on those toys. Shelves of action figures lined our home office, each one carefully dusted and placed like it was some kind of treasure. It used to be kind of cute when we were dating. "Oh, you collect these?" I'd say with a laugh, not realizing how serious he was about them. Over time, though, it started to annoy me. Every time I walked into that office, all I could see were wasted dollars sitting there, staring back at me like a silent accusation. I told myself it wasn't fair. How could he drop hundreds of dollars on collectibles when I couldn't even justify spending on myself? Like that pair of boots I wanted last month. I didn't buy them because we were supposed to be budgeting for a house. But then I found out he spent $300 on a rare action figure, and suddenly I couldn't see past it. "So I make sacrifices, but you get to blow our money on toys?" I thought. Don't get me wrong, Eric's not irresponsible. He puts money into savings every month. He pays for groceries, utilities, and even gets me gifts I've hinted at. But those gifts, they always seem to miss the mark. Like the gold necklace I mentioned once. I thought it would have a little more flair, but it was so plain I barely wore it. Or the weekend getaway he planned last year, which ended up being a quiet cabin in the woods. I wanted something exciting, and it just felt like effort wasted. And then there was the receipt. I found it crumpled in his desk drawer while I was putting away some papers. $300 for one figure. That was the last straw for me. He's saving for a house, but he can casually spend that much on a toy? I told myself it wasn't about the money. It was about principle, about priorities. But the truth is, I think I felt like I wasn't the priority. Those stupid figures seemed to mean more to him than I did. At least, that's what I let myself believe. I didn't realize how much I'd let those feelings fester until it was too late, until I'd done something I couldn't take back. It was Saturday morning, and Eric was up early, humming to himself as he got ready for his collector's meetup. He was always so excited for those gatherings, like a kid heading to summer camp. He'd carefully pack a few of his favorite action figures in a padded case, make sure his shirt was pressed, and even spray on cologne like he was going to some important business meeting. I found it ridiculous. As he kissed me goodbye, I barely looked up from my phone. "Don't spend too much money," I muttered, scrolling through Instagram. He just chuckled softly, like I was joking, and walked out the door. The moment he was gone, I found myself sinking into the couch, irritated for no real reason. Maybe it was the fact that he got to have his little hobby, while I felt like I was constantly holding back on what I wanted. My thoughts wandered to those boots I'd seen online a few weeks ago, the ones I hadn't bought because we were supposed to be watching our spending. Meanwhile, Eric was off dropping hundreds on toys that sat on a shelf collecting dust. I opened Instagram again, scrolling past influencers flaunting their perfect lives. Perfect wardrobes, perfect vacations. A woman posted a photo of a new pair of boots, the boots I had wanted, and my stomach twisted with jealousy. It wasn't fair. I worked just as hard as Eric, if not harder. Why did he get to indulge himself while I had to sacrifice? That's when I saw it. The crumpled receipt sticking out from the papers on the coffee table. I'd noticed it the day before, but hadn't really thought about it. Now, though, I grabbed it and smoothed it out. My blood boiled as I saw the total. $300. For a single action figure. I felt heat rise to my face. That was a third of the cost of the boots I couldn't buy. That was a spa day I hadn't treated myself to. That was a weekend trip I deserved. It wasn't just about the money, it was the principle. It was him, putting his toys above us, above me. Something inside me snapped. I stormed into the home office, where his shelves stood like a shrine to his hobby. Row after row of carefully arranged figures, each one pristine, each one taunting me with its stupid little smile. This was where our hard-earned money went. Not to our future, not to something that mattered, just to this. Without thinking, I grabbed a garbage bag from the kitchen. The sound of plastic rustling fueled me, my anger giving me a kind of twisted energy. One by one, I yanked the figures off the shelves and tossed them into the bag. Some of them still had their boxes, which I ripped open without a second thought. "This is what you care about?" I muttered to myself, my voice thick with anger. "This is what's more important than me?" The bag filled quickly, but I wasn't done. I grabbed another one, then another. I didn't stop to look at any of the figures. Why would I? They were just junk. I didn't think about the time he'd spent collecting them, or the stories he'd told me about some of the rare ones. By the time I finished, the shelves were bare, and my rage had been replaced with a cold, hollow sense of satisfaction. Let's see how important these are when they're gone, I thought. I drove to the nearest donation center, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. At the drop-off, the worker asked if I was sure I wanted to donate everything. "Yep," I said with a tight smile. "Someone else can enjoy them." On the way home, I felt vindicated. This was the wake-up call Eric needed. Maybe now he'd realize how childish he was being and start focusing on what really mattered. As I pulled into our driveway, I started fantasizing about what I'd buy with the money he'd save. The boots, of course, but maybe a nice spa day too. I deserved it. I stepped back into the house, feeling lighter, almost giddy. The empty shelves were like a blank slate, ready for something more practical, more grown up. Eric wouldn't be happy at first, but he'd understand eventually. At least that's what I told myself. That night, Eric barely said a word. He came home, took one look at the empty shelves, and froze. His face was impossible to read. Shock? Sadness? Anger? I couldn't tell. "Lisa, where are my figures?" he finally asked, his voice quiet, almost hollow. I shrugged, forcing nonchalance. "I donated them. It was time to grow up, Eric. We're saving for a house, remember?" He didn't yell. He didn't even argue. He just stared at me, his mouth opening slightly, as if to say something, then closing again. Finally, he whispered, "You didn't even ask me. You just decided." The way he said it made me feel small for half a second, but I pushed it down. "I was doing us a favor," I snapped, defensive. "You waste so much money on those things, Eric. It's ridiculous." Eric didn't respond. He walked to the couch, sat down, and pulled out his laptop. I expected him to sulk for a while and then get over it. But he sat there for hours, scrolling through forums and auction sites. He barely even looked at me. I got up to see what he was doing, and that's when I noticed the listings on his screen. One by one, he clicked through auctions for figures I recognized, their prices flashing on the screen. $400, $800, over $1,000. "That's insane," I muttered, almost laughing. "Why would anyone pay that much for a toy?" Eric didn't look at me. "Not all of them can be replaced," he said softly. For the first time, something twisted in my chest. I told myself it was guilt, but it felt more like annoyance. He was being so dramatic. Still, the look on his face, focused, heartbroken, made it harder to brush off than I expected. Over the next few days, Eric barely spoke to me. He came home from work, nodded a polite hello, and went straight to his laptop or out to meet friends. I told myself it was fine. He was pouting, and he'd get over it. But one evening, I overheard him on the phone with his best friend. "It's gone," he said quietly. "The one my dad gave me. I can't believe it." I froze. The figure his dad gave him? That sounded familiar. I remembered him mentioning it once, but I couldn't recall the details. Something about his father giving it to him as a kid, back when they used to collect together. A pit formed in my stomach. Later that night, I found a small photo album Eric had left on his desk. I opened it out of curiosity, and my heart sank. There was a picture of a young Eric grinning ear to ear, holding a superhero figure in his small hands. Beside him stood his father, smiling proudly. I turned the page and found more photos of Eric as a child, posing with his collection as it grew over the years. It wasn't just a hobby, it was a bond he'd shared with his dad. And I'd thrown it all away. I didn't know what to do. My stomach churned as I replayed the moment in my head, the way I'd carelessly shoved those figures into bags, muttering to myself about how stupid they were. I hadn't even stopped to think, hadn't considered what they might mean to him. I tried to fix it. I called the donation center first thing the next morning, begging them to check if the items were still there. But the woman on the phone sighed and told me they'd already been sold to a reseller. "Sorry, ma'am," she said. "We can't track them now." When Eric came home that evening, I couldn't avoid it anymore. I sat him down and confessed. "Eric," I began, my voice shaking, I didn't know one of those figures was from your dad." He didn't look surprised. He just nodded, his face calm but distant. "It wasn't just one, Lisa," he said quietly. "They all meant something to me, every single one." "I didn't mean to hurt you," I stammered, tears pricking my eyes. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought—" "You didn't think at all," he interrupted, his voice sharp for the first time. "You didn't care enough to think. You decided your opinion mattered more than mine, and you didn't even ask me." His words hit like a punch to the gut. I opened my mouth to argue, to defend myself, but I couldn't, because deep down, I knew he was right. "You didn't just throw away my collection," he said, his voice breaking. "You threw away memories. Memories I'll never get back." The tears I'd been holding back spilled over. "I'm sorry," I whispered, but it felt hollow even to me. Eric stood, his shoulders heavy. "I need some time, Lisa. I need to figure out if we, are something I can keep fighting for." I watched him walk into the bedroom, and a part of me knew that things would never be the same. After our conversation, Eric began spending more time out of the house. He'd leave early and come back late, barely speaking to me when he was home. I told myself he was still sulking, that he just needed time to cool off. But deep down, I knew something was shifting. One afternoon, I was cleaning up the home office, the shelves still bare, glaring at me like a reminder of what I'd done. That's when I found it. A small, leather-bound notebook tucked behind some papers on his desk. I hesitated before opening it, unsure if I should invade his privacy, but curiosity got the better of me. As I flipped through the pages, I realized it was a journal, a detailed record of his collection. Each page was dedicated to a different figure, complete with dates, prices, and little notes about why it was important to him. One entry caught my eye. "Dad's figure, first edition. He gave it to me after my first Little League game. Told me it was my reward for trying my best. Still reminds me to push through, even when things are tough." My stomach twisted as I read those words. This wasn't just a collection to him. It was a timeline of his life, a tribute to his memories, and a connection to his late father. I thought about the figure he'd mentioned to his friend, the one from his dad, and realized with a sinking feeling that I'd destroyed something irreplaceable. That evening, Eric came home, his face calm but distant. I tried to talk to him, to bridge the growing chasm between us. "Eric," I began hesitantly, "I found your notebook today. I didn't know how much those figures meant to you." He gave me a long, measured look. "You didn't care enough to know," he replied flatly. The words stung, but I pressed on. "I was angry, and I acted without thinking. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Can we fix this?" Eric sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Lisa, this isn't just about the figures. This is about you. You didn't respect me. You've been dismissing me and the things I care about for years. The collection was just the final straw." I felt my face flush. "That's not fair. I've always supported you." "Supported me?" he shot back, his voice rising. Lisa, you've mocked me for years. Every time I got excited about something, you rolled your eyes. Every time I tried to share a piece of my world with you, you made me feel stupid. And then you threw away something I've spent my whole life building without even asking me. I opened my mouth to argue, but stopped when I saw the pain in his eyes. I need space, he said firmly. I need to figure out if this is the kind of relationship I want to keep fighting for. His words hit me like a brick. This wasn't just about toys or money, it was about respect, and I had destroyed it. The next morning, Eric packed a small suitcase and left to stay with a friend. He didn't yell or slam the door. He just walked out quietly, leaving the apartment emptier than I'd ever felt it before. In the silence, I sat on the couch and replayed the last few days over and over, piecing together the moments I'd missed or dismissed entirely. Every time I rolled my eyes at his enthusiasm, every time I'd scoffed at a thoughtful gift, every time I'd belittled the things he loved because they didn't matter to me. And now, for the first time, I realized what I'd done wasn't just selfish. It was cruel. Eric wasn't just walking away from the collection. He was walking away from me. And I couldn't blame him. Eric didn't come back after that morning. At first, I told myself it was temporary. He just needed a few days to cool off, and then we'd talk it out. But days turned into weeks, and every time I texted him, his replies were brief and polite. I'm staying with Mike. I need time to think. Through mutual friends, I started hearing about how he was doing. He'd moved into a small apartment not far from where we lived, and to my surprise, he seemed happy, free. He's been going to collector meetups again, one friend casually mentioned during a coffee catch-up. He even found a couple of the figures he lost. He looks lighter, like a weight's been lifted. It was like a punch to the gut. I'd expected him to be miserable without me, to realize how much he needed me in his life. Instead, he was thriving. And it wasn't just the collection. He was reconnecting with old friends, picking up hobbies he'd neglected for years. One mutual friend even showed me a photo of him at a convention, grinning ear to ear while holding up a new addition to his collection. He looked younger, happier, like a version of him I hadn't seen in years. He's different now, the friend said, almost in awe. He's finally himself again. Meanwhile, I was left with an empty apartment, haunted by the consequences of my own selfishness. The bare shelves in the office mocked me every time I walked past them, a constant reminder of what I'd taken from Eric, and from us. I tried to distract myself, but the guilt followed me everywhere. Every time I saw a photo of Eric smiling, it was like a knife twisting in my chest. He was flourishing in his new life, while I was stuck replaying every moment where I'd belittled him, dismissed him, or made him feel small. I started searching resale sites, hoping to find the figure his dad had given him. It became an obsession. I'd stay up late scrolling through endless listings, but I never found it. The realization that it was gone forever hit me harder every time. One day, I came across a social media post of Eric at another collector's meetup. He was holding a rare figure, surrounded by other smiling collectors. But what caught my eye, and shattered me, was the woman standing next to him. She was holding a figure too, her smile bright, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The caption read, "Starting fresh. Finally feeling like myself again." My breath caught in my throat. He looked so happy, so alive, and so gone. Not just from my life, but from the person he'd been when we were together. He wasn't weighed down anymore. I closed the app and stared at the empty shelf in our office, tears streaming down my face. He'd moved on, rebuilt himself, and found someone who appreciated him. And me, I was left with nothing but regret. Eric had freed himself from the weight of my disrespect, and now he was flourishing, and I was left to carry the weight of my own selfishness. Alone. The apartment feels unbearably quiet now. It's not the peaceful kind of quiet you savor after a long day. It's heavy, suffocating. The empty shelves in the office seem louder than anything else, a constant reminder of what I threw away. Not just Eric's collection, but him. I've been replaying everything over and over in my head. Every sarcastic comment, every eye roll, every time I dismissed the things that brought him joy because I didn't think they mattered. I told myself I was the practical one, the responsible one. But the truth is, I was selfish. I wanted him to care about what I cared about, and resented him for finding happiness in something that wasn't about me. Now, I see it for what it was. Those figures weren't just toys. They were his memories, his connection to his dad, his escape from the stress of everyday life. And instead of supporting him, I destroyed something irreplaceable. I've tried to move on, but it feels impossible. I spend hours scrolling through resale sites, obsessively searching for the figure his dad gave him. I've even set alerts for auctions, hoping to find something, anything, that might undo what I did. But I know it's not enough. Eric is thriving now. I hear from friends that he's happier than ever, rebuilding his collection piece by piece and meeting people who share his passion. Every so often, I'll see a photo of him pop up online, smiling like he hasn't in years. And then there was her, the woman standing next to him at a collector's meetup, her hand resting casually on his arm. She looked so natural next to him, like she belonged there, like I never did. I stared at that photo for what felt like hours, the caption echoing in my mind. Starting fresh. Finally feeling like myself again. He had found himself, rebuilt himself, while I was left with nothing but guilt and the weight of my own actions. I sit in the office sometimes, staring at the empty shelves. I imagine what they used to look like, row after row of carefully placed figures, each one with a story, each one a part of Eric's life that I never cared to understand. I thought I was teaching him a lesson, I whisper to the silence. Turns out the lesson was mine all along. The shelves remain empty, just like the space Eric once filled in my life. And I'm left to wonder if I'll ever escape the regret of what I lost, or if this is the punishment I truly deserve.